This was a very rough design idea which I roughly sketched. So the idea was the ninja would start at the far left hand side and get to the end of the village, and the player would be able to accomplish this task by using a various number of platforms to avoid enemy paths. They would also be able to drop down, surprise enemies, attack them, retrieve specific weapons such as kunais and swords, and whilst doing all of this they would have to avoid environmental threats such as fires. So I went about creating the high poly sculpt for my ninja within ZBrush. Once I'd actually completed this, I then decided to begin retopping inside of ZBrush. I roughly retopped most of the subtools for the ninja down to about 3,000 odd polys, which basically was my main target. So I wanted to try and retain the shape of the character silhouette in the low poly as well. So once I had actually imported my character into 3ds Max, I set about further optimizing the topology. So once I had fully retopped the character, I then unwrapped the character. I then began texturing, and for the texturing phase there were two main iterations. So after having blocked out the character, this is what it did look like, and then after having received feedback I decided to go back and work into it rather significantly to produce this. So the second key asset to my game was the enemy. The workflow which I used to create the ninja was used to also produce the enemy. So there are two forms of enemies, both consisting of the same mesh, just using different textures to help differentiate them from one another in game, as they all have a different way of going about attacking and attempting to kill the player. Once I'd finished the high poly sculpt for the enemy mesh, I also sculpted the Desert Eagle weapon. So I produced the low poly for the Desert Eagle first, imported it into ZBrush, and then produced the high poly version of the Desert Eagle in ZBrush to then bake down onto the low poly. I had finished retopping the character, and with the enemy mesh, once I'd actually unwrapped and once I began texturing it, I realised that the proportions of the character were off, so I had to reiterate the proportions. So I went back into 3ds Max, changed the proportions of the character, so I made the legs longer and also made them thicker. I also increased the length of the arms and I reduced the size of the head. So the final key asset within my level were actually the buildings, as they make up the environment for the most part. The way I went about creating the buildings was first gathering reference together, looking at Japanese villages such as Takayama. Once I'd conducted all of my research, I then began modelling the buildings and blocking them out within 3ds Max. I then unwrapped them, and using my reference, I then began texturing my buildings based off of the reference. Once I textured the buildings, as I didn't actually high poly sculpt any of these buildings, I used online normal map generators to actually generate normal maps for me to save time. I used the normal maps to generate ambient occlusion maps, and the gloss and metalness maps were made from the albedo. Okay, so one technical issue which I couldn't actually find a solution to was actually setting a rage mode material for the ninja. So once the player's health reached 0.25, I wanted it so that the material would update in real time, allowing a red glow to appear to tell the player that the character is in a low health range. So this included creating myself a variable referred to as regular and one which was referred to as rage, and the variable types were both set to material. And then basically what I tried to do was set it so that once the player had taken damage, if the player health was 0.25 or under, the character mesh would come off the blue pin and the set material node would be hooked up to it, and the rage material instance with the emissive glow on it would be set. When I attempted to do this, the rage effect actually worked for the enemy mesh, so I really wanted to actually implement this feature. So basically what I ended up doing was implementing this with the boss fight. So once the boss's health reaches 25, then the rage mode triggers on the boss. Okay, so the biggest technical difficulty which I encountered by far was the animation state machine for the player. So the player begins with one melee attack which consists of a dual kick, and This is supposed to change if the player actually obtains the sword, so this would in turn replace the melee animation. So setting this up was really difficult and took a lot of time. I tried a number of different things, including changing what was in the event graph, setting different variables for the kicking as well as the sword attack animations. One method which I attempted was having it so that the animation state machine would update in real time, so if the player did interact with the sword, the melee attack would be swapped out for the sword attack. The only issue with this was the character was stuck in an idle state and was only able to attack and jump. Another attempt in attempting to get the sword attack animation to play once the player had obtained the sword was me creating an input action for the sword attack and dragging the mesh pin and forcing the mesh to play the sword attack animation and hooking that up to input action, and that also failed. I then decided to create an animation blueprint child of the original blueprint. In the child, I changed the melee attack animation to the sword attack animation, and upon the player picking up the sword, the animation state machine would update and change to that of the child blueprint, and this worked. Overall, I'm quite content with the way the project turned out overall. I feel that the design evolved from the initial design idea into something much better, because the initial design concept wouldn't have really felt like a game which featured a ninja as a main character, as it was a lot more attack based, and overall I feel like the game plays quite decently. From an art standpoint, I'm fairly content with the way the art assets turned out. I feel if I had produced and actually finished more assets, I feel like that would have been better just to fill up some space. And if I had made use of more decal, that would have given another level of polish to the level the ninja needs to fall animation. And from a technical standpoint, the blueprints are not all perfect. There are a few issues. For example, if the player tosses a smoke grenade, the AI movement isn't immediately cancelled. The AI will continue travelling whilst in an idle stance and then stop maybe 2 to 3 seconds after the smoke grenade has actually been tossed. So not all of these scripts actually function the way they are supposed to, but aside from that, I feel like I have a fairly solid vertical slice. Initially I was supposed to have a kunai weapon. I changed this to a smoke grenade as I didn't want the ninja to be attack based specific character, and the ninja is also outnumbered, so I want there to be a level of strategy implemented into the game whilst the player is running through the village. However, I didn't want the gameplay to be too slow, as platformers are fairly fast paced. The ninja was initially supposed to be able to deflect bullets. I removed this feature as, again, I feel as though the ninja would be too powerful as a result of it. I also had the initial idea of having a destructible mesh. I removed this mainly for game optimization because I do have multiple different particle effects running in the game at once, so a destructible mesh with a fire particle on top of it would affect performance. In the initial design there was supposed to be moving platforms. I decided to remove this as I wanted there to be an element of realism to the gameplay. I wanted to actually integrate the platforms into the environment, so I wanted some of the building, for instance, to be interactable as well as trees, which is what I ended up doing. And there are multiple different ways for the player to actually die. For instance, if the player does have body armor and if the player lands in some fire, the body armor won't actually protect the player from dying quickly, and this is simply because having armor won't really protect a human being from, burns to the skin, so it would still be a fairly quick death. The biggest change would be the tea house, which I implemented, which would allow for the player to actually hide as the ninja, and this was implemented to actually make the game feel like a ninja based platformer with some strategy elements, because without that feature allowing the player to hide like a ninja would before striking an enemy, the game didn't really make too much sense in its context, and without that particular mechanic any random character with a gun could go blasting through the village, and that's not the feel which I wanted to create for the game.